Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the bill that would absolutely bar employment in college sports going forward. It's a very, very interesting thing that you absolutely will hear a ton about on here and around the college football world over the next little bit. But let's get into segment two here and let's talk about the issues with the 12-team playoff. There's definitely some things that are going to be some consequences of the 12-team playoff that we're not going to love so much. Obviously, there's some great things about it. During that month, it's going to be just incredible to be in the middle of all of that stuff. But the reality is there are going to be some things that go by the wayside. And I think the biggest thing for me is what kind of the regular season looks like, especially the end of the regular season, then maybe into conference title week, depending on kind of the different scenarios that happen down the road. So there's a couple of different arguments around this. I think the big one for me is what happens if you have an undefeated team that walks into the last week of the season and they're not necessarily playing a big time opponent. The best example that I have is Utah is going to UCF in the last week of the season. Not necessarily a huge game for either of those teams, not necessarily, rivalry or anything like that. Let's say Utah goes in 11-1 and they've locked up a spot in Arlington and they're definitely in the Big 12 championship. They're playing for a spot in the playoff. Nothing can really change that. I'd love to tell you that Kyle Whittingham is going to send out his first team guys and he's going to play his starters the entire game and he's going to want to win that game because he wants to go undefeated. But I can't necessarily tell you that. I don't necessarily think that's something that's going to happen because the reality is you now have to make sure that you're ready to play possibly 17 games in a season. At the very least 16 if you get that bye in the first round of the playoffs. So that's a lot of games. You got to stay healthy. That is number one on the sheet in every single locker room across the country right now is take care of your body because you're going to have to use it plenty once we get into the season. And Utah is a great example of a team that could go 11-1 going into that last weekend, not necessarily playing a game that is all that important to the fan base that is going to dominate conversation in the last week of the season, but if you're Utah, there is that kind of double-edged sword. Do you want to go undefeated or do you want to be fully ready for Arlington and fully ready to get into the playoff? I'd argue they want to be ready for Arlington. I'd argue they'd rather go 11-1 and make the playoff than go 12-0 and then possibly lose in the Big 12 championship and get a 9 seed and have to play a really good opponent in the second round. So it's going to be a battle. It's going to be a really interesting thing to kind of watch unfold. Another one that frankly I'm a little bit less worried about than some other people are is if you're in the SEC or the Big Ten, there's a good chance if you make that conference title game, you're in. I don't think there's really any question about that, frankly. We'll get into that a little bit later in the show, but I wonder if an SEC team, let's say they come into that game really banged up and they could win, but not necessarily in their cards. Maybe they're not favored by they're underdogs by 8 points, let's say, and there's an injury or two on their team and they're just trying to get healthy. I don't think it's crazy to say that they would, maybe hold back a little bit in that conference title game. Probably not necessarily throw it by any means, but the reality is there's going to have to be some business decisions made in these kind of games down the road because you have to be ready for the big time games. You have to be ready to, possibly lift that big time trophy at the end of the day. And that's obviously the ultimate goal. So it'll be really interesting to see all this unfold. The final argument that's kind of an issue with really more the late regular season than anything else is what happens if we see the same game 2 times in a row, or maybe multiple times in a row with the playoff in the conversation. And I think the biggest one is obviously Ohio State, Michigan in the Big Ten. Obviously, they do play in the last week of the season. They could be in the Big Ten championship because no more divisions in these conferences going forward. So people kind of get a little bit upset of that. To me, if I'm being totally honest, I don't necessarily mind. I think the best way to go forward, especially in a 12-team playoff with some automatic bids, is make sure you have the best teams in that thing make sure you have the absolute best teams filling out the at-large bids as you possibly can. And don't necessarily alter things because you don't want a certain matchup to happen again, or you don't want certain things that was one thing that always kind of made me frustrated is you make this argument whether it's Ohio State or Michigan or whatever. I mean, 2022, I guess, was the perfect example of this, where Ohio State and Michigan were both in on the playoff, and I don't necessarily think they had to switch things up to make it not to make sure they didn't play. But the reality is that was definitely a topic of conversation rolling into that week, where it was, we got to make sure TCU's playing Michigan, Ohio State's playing Georgia, or TCU's playing Georgia or excuse me, or Michigan's playing Georgia and Ohio State's playing TCU. That was something that was kind of going on during that conversation. I didn't necessarily love it because I don't necessarily love altering any seeding to make sure that you avoid a certain matchup or make sure that these teams don't play again, because that's the reality of this sport. Sometimes it's going to line up that way. Sometimes it's going to line up where Ohio State is the fourth best team because they just won the Big Ten, and Michigan is the fifth best team, and they have to match up at some point. That should just be the way it is. I understand it's not necessarily the most ideal thing in the world to see these teams play each other over and over again, but if that's what needs to happen, if that's what's supposed to happen based on, the strength of these teams, I'm all for it. I understand there is going to be some things that aren't necessarily ideal. There's going to be some kind of fights back and forth where maybe that, first Ohio State Michigan game isn't as big of a deal as we've become accustomed to it being. Maybe they focus more on the Big Ten game because that's the one with the playoff implications. Maybe, it takes away a little bit from those rivalry week games because you got bigger fish to fry at the end of the day. And obviously that's something that frankly worries me the most when we talk about this. I think when we talk about the playoff, there's tons of things that go into this, and there's tons of things that make us worried about what the 12-team playoff holds. But I think the biggest thing, and the reason that I, wasn't too big of a fan of the 12-team playoff when it came around, was, to me, college football is the regular season. I've never really been someone that worried too much about what the playoff was going to be or how the bowl games were going to shake out. And beyond my teams, obviously, you're focusing on that. But I do think there is a certain part of it that I love the regular season. I love the matchups that we see every single year. I love Texas OU split down the middle in the Red River Showdown. I love the Iron Bowl. I love Ohio State, Michigan getting into it before the game. All these games that mean so much to college football, they usually happen in the regular season. I understand the final trophy is handed out at the end, and that's the one that everyone's after, especially now. But I do think there is, the special parts about college football, the vast majority of them happen in the regular season. And I think, I think one of the worries with the 12-team playoff, at least from my point of view, is what happens to some of these games. Does Georgia walk into Georgia Tech and rest some of their players because they're undefeated and already in the SEC championship game, which is not necessarily ideal by any means. Actually, I want to get into Brent Key's comments on Georgia here at some point this week, so stay tuned for that. But there's going to be a ton of things that happen because of this, and some of them are not going to be ideal. There is a reality where some of these, last week games, the big time games that we all look forward to all season, might be a little less important because maybe one team is already in the championship game. Maybe one team's already in the playoff, hypothetically, because the reality is if you get to the SEC or the Big Ten championship, you're in the playoff. I feel very confident about that. I think that's going to be that way for quite some time. So maybe there's not as much urgency in those big time games, the Iron Bowl possibly. Maybe Alabama's already in the playoff and they don't necessarily need to play quite as aggressively or quite as hard or play all the guys that they usually play in that game. Maybe Notre Dame's already in and they rest some guys against USC. Maybe Clemson's already in, they rest some guys against South Carolina. So there's going to be some worries about this. There's going to be some consequences that none of us want. And frankly, I think some of them might come, in the games that maybe you're not too concerned about on that last week, the Utah going to UCF. Maybe that's not that big of a deal to you. And if Utah does rest some players in that game, it's not that big of a deal. Or Miami goes to Syracuse in the last week. Maybe they, kind of hang out and wear a bunch of t-shirts and sweats and all of the big time players aren't playing for, excuse me, all the big time players aren't playing for the Hurricanes that day. So there's a ton of stuff that goes into this. There's going to be some fights back and forth. There's going to be some different things that happen because of it. But one thing I feel pretty confident in is there's going to be some regular season games that just don't mean as much. Whether that's, the week, before that, the week 11 games with all the FCS teams against the SEC teams, or it's rivalry week that kind of takes the brunt of this. But I do think it's going to happen. I do think there's going to be some regular season games that we've all, circled on the calendar in past years that might fall by the wayside a little bit. And I think that's kind of just the reality of a 12-team playoff. When that many teams are getting in, when that many teams have a basis to get in, especially when you have auto bids, which is another problem I have with the 12 team playoff, which is something we can get into a little bit later. But when you have all of that stuff, there's going to be teams that take a week off because they're already in the playoff, or take a week off because they already are playing in the game that gets them a spot in the playoff. So it's going to be weird. Frankly, to me, I hate anything that lessens what it means in the regular season. I think that was the biggest reason I wasn't a fan of the 12 team playoff. Was the regular season is college football. The postseason is great. The postseason is a very, very fun thing for us to kind of sink our teeth into, but there's very few things that define college football that happen in the postseason. All of the stuff, the rivalries, the traditions, the chants, everything in between, they happen in the regular season because those games are being played in college stadiums in front of students with all of the energy behind them. So I think there's just a different way of going about things. I tend to lean and make regular season as important as possible, and if the postseason has to suffer a little bit because of that, so be it. Some other people are full in on the postseason and want to make sure that the 12 team or 16 team or a million team playoff is as perfect as possible. And if that happens, then they'll be perfectly happy. I personally believe that when you take for the playoff or for the postseason in general, you take away from the regular season and you hurt some of what makes college football. So it's going to be an interesting thing to kind of see unfold. Once we're in the playoff, I'm sure I'm going to be fully gung-ho on it, be very, very excited about it, and be totally in on it. But the reality is there's going to be some bumps on the way there. There's no doubt in my mind, and there's going to be some regular season games that we've become so accustomed to being such a big deal that just won't be quite as big a deal going forward. But we'll see all that unfold. We'll see all that kind of come to fruition this upcoming year. But let's take our second break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some first-round quarterbacks that are kind of hiding in the brush. There's a couple of guys that I really want to break down for you today that I think could make a huge leap into maybe from the third round, fourth round to the first round this upcoming year, depending on how they play. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.